that your stance work is kind of like the deadlift. I wanted to speak a little bit more about that and clarify a little bit. See, in powerlifting, and we'll use powerlifting for now because different lifting sports have different bases, but in powerlifting, they have 3 lifts. They have deadlift, squat, and bench press. And while we can make arguments for and against all day long, it still remains that these are primal movement patterns. They are important movement patterns to just your general muscular development, and they, being so primal, are kind of part of the basis of what we do. I mean, pushing out, we push out all the time. Standing up with a load underneath us and standing up with a load on top of us. Very, very important things. I mean, fighting against gravity is kind of a big deal because it is the one force that we are constantly under at all times. I mean, unless of course you go out into space, in which case there is still gravity, just not the same as Earth's gravity. But I wanted to bring up this idea though, correlating your martial arts training to these primal lifts. See, in martial arts training, depending on what school you go to and whatnot, what style you're playing with, there are going to be some commonalities. I mean, we're humans with a body and 2 arms and 2 legs for the most part. I mean, barring extreme disability or mutation. But that being the case, there are some things that kind of just have to get trained. You've got striking, handwork. Your handwork is kind of like the bench press. You really can't ignore it. Are you always going to need the handwork? No. Are you always going to, be laying down and have to lift something off you? Well, no. But it's still a primal movement pattern. That pressing away from your core is an extremely important movement pattern to work. And yeah, we can press here, we can press here, we can press here. I mean, there's that whole 180-degree range, even plus a few degrees here and there if you have really flexible shoulders. But I mean, that whole 180 degrees of pressing away from your center is really, really important. But other importance, because we get so focused on striking, other importance is going to be how you stand and how you move. Now, how you stand, my kitten is biting the tripod. Anyway, sorry, it's funny. Your stance work and your footwork, your moving footwork, both are kind of like your squat and deadlift. Now, I said your stance is like a deadlift. Really, your stance is going to be more like your squat. This is kind of more your static strength. It's not the driving strength that you get from a deadlift. Squats do build explosive power, but squats build it differently. They're a little less functional per se than a deadlift because we don't put things on our shoulders and pick them up off the ground very frequently in everyday life as we do just pick stuff up off the ground. And you don't get any more functional than a deadlift. And honestly, that right there answers the question, which is king of exercises, deadlift or squat? It's the deadlift because of the real world crossover and functionality. As opposed to squat being a fantastic exercise, you just don't find yourself in the position of strapping things over your back quite as much. Unless, of course, you're a wrestler who specializes in fireman's carry. But, so your stance work is really going to be more like your squats. And of course, we don't have just one stance, but the most common stance is going to be some variation of the horse stance or horse riding stance. And I mean, there's all sorts of variations. There's the Yichi Kim No Ma, which we talked about. It's the Wing Chun stance, which really isn't a horse stance. It's just a square standing stance. And then you have more the traditional karate horse stance, and even some kung fu schools use the higher horse stance, where your legs are at about a 45-degree angle. And then, of course, you have your deep horse stance, which, you know, is like riding a fucking Shire horse. But more importantly, it's really for building the legs. It is truly a strength exercise. The more karate style horse stance at the 45-degree angles is more of the functional square stance, something where you can find your root and blast off if you need to. We don't fight squarely very much, but if you do, somewhere in the range of 1.5 times your shoulder width, 45-degree bend in the legs, and really grounded is going to give you some pretty strong base. You know, and of course, I mean, we have bow stances and forward stances and front stances and all sorts of variations of the forward-backward split fighting type stance. And we're not going to get into the specifics of those right here. But now your footwork is going to be more like your deadlift, and your footwork is really, it's your moving, it's your positioning, it's your structure, and then of course we can't throw in footwork without mentioning kicking, because kicking is of course part of your footwork. And with the exception of perhaps Taekwondo and Savate, kicking is really usually taking a sideline as kind of a punctuation mark in a general defense or offense technique. And it's mainly because despite the incredible power of the legs, it's something like 2.5 times stronger than your arms in natural proportion. Despite the strength, they are slower. They're farther away from the target, and you have to undergo some pretty serious training to get the speed and timing up there to match the handwork. But still, more important than the kicking is really the movement. So dealing with directional movement, 45 degrees, lateral stepping, it's all incredibly important. Retreating as well as advancing, shearing angles versus broad angles, circles as well as lines. I mean, this is where the Kempo Yantra comes into that I mentioned a few videos back. Circles within circles and lines surrounding and cutting through. It's a fantastic diagram. But this is more like your deadlift. Your footwork it's moving. It's where your hip drive is. It's where your grounding and exploding. Grounding and exploding comes from. So really, your footwork is your deadlift. Your stance work is your squat. Your hand work is your bench press. And I'm not at all saying that these things will replace squat, deadlift, and bench press. You should be squatting, deadlifting, and bench pressing in some capacity. But still, considering all of that, if for some reason you don't have access to weights or sandbags or another person, you realize you can do those things with people, right? There's always your own body weight work and your own training. And in martial arts, we don't often have the time or energy to train both technique and strength training in separate workouts. We don't always have time for that. And if you have to pick one over the other, of course, naturally we pick the martial arts training. Just remember that you can train strength with body weight and using some very, very cool exercises, which we'll get into at a later date. But I just want you to start thinking about your basics in terms of the basics of your primal movement patterns. I mean, pressing and striking, same pattern. The energy you put into it is much different, but the same movement pattern. Your stance work is like a static squat. Your footwork is like a dynamic deadlift, working on your hip drive and leg explosion. It is just something that you have to really start thinking about and correlating between the two. That's all I got for you. I've already rambled on too long. It's almost a 10-minute video, so I'll talk to you guys later. Good journey.